Medieval street gangs weren't just a story passed down through whispers of the past. They were disturbingly real, and far more sinister than most people imagine today. Some didn't just exist. They thrived. They ruled over neighborhoods, walked the streets with impunity, and held power in ways that made even monarchs uneasy. So why is it that so few people ever mention them? And what exactly were these gangs doing that could shake the confidence of kings? To get a sense of their presence, you'd only need to take a walk through the bustling heart of 15th century London. Just make sure you keep one hand clutched firmly around your coin purse. Roaming the streets of London during the 1400s wasn't just about avoiding horse-drawn carts or navigating the smells of the market. It meant keeping your eyes peeled for something far more dangerous: organized gangs who had turned the chaos of urban life into their playground. These weren't simple criminals acting out of desperation. No, groups like the Company of the Night owned the darkness, and even their name made it clear. They were creatures of the shadows. To them, the city wasn't a place of order. It was their arena. But instead of games and laughter, the playground was made of bloodied alleyways and sword-swinging brawls. These young men strutted around with daggers casually swinging from their belts, as if bearing arms in public were as normal as wearing a hat. There were laws on the books banning weapons in certain districts, but trying to enforce those laws was about as effective as trying to patch a sinking ship with parchment. What truly made these gangs a curiosity wasn't just their behavior, it was who they were. These weren't desperate, starving peasants trying to survive. In many cases, they were the sons of affluent merchant families, privileged young men who had everything and chose violence as their leisure activity. When life gives you wealth, power, and freedom, but no purpose, some choose chaos over comfort. Markets, which should have been centers of commerce and community, often turned into open-air battlegrounds, with fights erupting over nothing more than a sideways glance or an imagined insult. Even church grounds, typically sanctuaries from violence, offered no refuge when hot-headed young men armed with blades wandered by. And when these troublemakers did land in custody, they didn't stay long. Bribery, political strings, and family money could smooth over just about any legal inconvenience. In fact, navigating your way out of a medieval jail cell was sometimes easier than reserving a seat at a crowded tavern. The city attempted to push back, banning weapons in specific zones. But these efforts had all the impact of a poorly worded warning sign. Some gangs operated freely for years, as if the city itself belonged to them. But this urban lawlessness wasn't the whole story. In truth, it was only the beginning. Outside the cities, England's highways offered no relief. Traveling the countryside was like playing dice with fate, except the stakes were your possessions and your life. These weren't just random bandits hiding in the bushes. These were well-coordinated groups who treated robbery like a carefully planned profession. What set these highway gangs apart was their discipline. They weren't desperate or sloppy. They were tactical, often setting up bases near forest edges, border crossings, or major trade routes, places where escape was easy and profit was plentiful. Deception was one of their deadliest tools. Disguises became standard. Some posed as monks, knowing full well that travelers were more likely to trust a man of God. Others went further, dressing as royal guards to give their ambushes a veneer of legitimacy. Imagine discovering that the monk who offered you blessings was actually calculating the best moment to steal your horse. These groups weren't lightly armed either. They rode horses and carried longbows, axes, spears, everything you'd need for swift and brutal takedowns. Infamous woodlands like Sherwood and Barnesdale didn't just inspire legends. They became real-world safe havens for roaming criminals. In just 1 year, 1317, more than 300 gang members were captured for crimes along the trade routes. and that only included the ones unlucky enough to get caught. Merchants didn't stay helpless for long. Many began traveling in convoys and hiring private protection. But even then, the criminals adapted. Some gangs began setting up fake checkpoints where they charged travelers for safe passage. These tolls weren't official, but they were enforced by blades. It was protection from robbers, by robbers. A business model so devious, it would leave modern insurance agents speechless. And if you think it couldn't get any worse, it did. After medieval wars ended, thousands of trained soldiers found themselves with no battlefields left to fight on. With no wars to win and no armies to serve, many took their hard-earned combat experience and turned it into a new career path: organized crime. These men didn't think of themselves as bandits. They called themselves free companies. But in reality, the difference between a mercenary group and a criminal gang was often just a matter of presentation. The White Company became infamous across Europe, roaming England, France, and Italy like a traveling army of destruction. With military training, they elevated robbery to a terrifying new standard. These weren't ragtag groups. They had siege equipment, armor, and cavalry. Local defenses didn't stand a chance. Nobles and manor houses were their favorite targets. They offered both riches and fortified positions, perfect for a criminal siege. Once surrounded, the occupants were captured and ransomed. For the rich, wealth had suddenly become a liability, a flashing beacon for violent opportunists. But the strategy worked. In fact, some cities would pay these mercenaries to attack their enemies, only to be robbed by them immediately afterward. They were masters of double dipping, getting paid to fight, then stealing from the same hands that fed them. Former knights and military leaders ran these operations, using battlefield tactics and hierarchical structures. They didn't just act like armies. They were armies with missions that revolved entirely around profit. It proved something dangerous. If you combined discipline, chainmail, and a moral compass that spun like a weather vane, you could create something nearly unstoppable. Towns couldn't resist them. Law enforcement was useless. Only another trained army could take them down. And believe it or not, some of the sharpest criminal minds of the era came from universities. Places like Oxford and Paris were meant to educate scholars, not teach the finer points of brawling and blackmail. But somehow, that's what happened. Students learned Latin, theology, and on the side, how to intimidate, fight, and manipulate their way through the medieval underworld. Because in the end, whether you were a knight, a noble, or a university student, medieval crime wasn't about desperation, it was about power. And for those who had the means, terrorizing society became not just an option but a career. Conflicts between townspeople and university students, known as town versus gown, were far from the polite academic disputes people might imagine today. These weren't just tense debates over ideas or philosophies. They were violent street brawls, raw, chaotic clashes that often ended with bodies lying in the dirt, blood soaking into cobblestones. Students didn't just study in groups. They formed small, organized militias that terrorized local populations with the same passionate energy they brought to their scholarly pursuits. In many university towns, student-run protection rackets operated with disturbing efficiency. Groups of students would storm into taverns or local shops, help themselves to food, drink, or whatever else caught their eye, then brazenly refused to pay. If the owners protested, they were met not with reasoned arguments, but with threats or outright violence. It was as if these young scholars had transformed theft into a twisted academic discipline, complete with Latin terms to justify their actions. In one infamous case, A group of students kidnapped a tavern keeper simply because he criticized their taste in wine. They held him captive until he issued an apology and a promise to improve his selection. For most merchants, resistance quickly became too costly. The safest choice was simply to accept whatever the students offered, which was often nothing at all. These so-called academic gentlemen roamed the streets armed with clubs, daggers, and an almost theatrical sense of entitlement, sometimes getting into bloody fights while still dressed in their ceremonial university robes. Imagine witnessing someone being stabbed by a figure who looked more prepared to give a graduation speech than commit assault. It must have felt like watching a commencement ceremony erupt into a riot. What made these gangs especially dangerous was the unique legal shield they operated under. Unlike ordinary criminals, many of these student offenders were protected by the special privileges granted to universities. Local authorities found themselves powerless to arrest or prosecute most of them. These gang members effectively enjoyed medieval diplomatic immunity, allowed to wreak havoc under the banner of education. Even those pursuing religious studies weren't above cracking skulls in the name of pride or vengeance. A spiritual calling didn't always stand in the way of violent tendencies. At the heart of this unchecked chaos was a legal system riddled with corruption and nepotism. In the medieval world, justice wasn't an abstract principle. It was a service that could be bought and sold like any other commodity. Local officials didn't merely turn a blind eye to the violence. They were often directly involved in shielding the perpetrators. Through a network of bribes and family alliances, the most violent student criminals were protected at the highest levels. Some of the worst offenders wore not tattered cloaks, but official robes, proving that the most dangerous gangsters weren't always found in alleyways. They often sat behind desks, writing laws or manipulating them for personal gain. Powerful families leaned on their influence to safeguard their sons, cousins, and nephews, even when they had been caught terrorizing entire neighborhoods. Court documents from cities like York frequently list the same surnames tied to the same violent acts. Yet no meaningful consequences ever followed. Criminal charges were mysteriously dropped. Key evidence vanished without explanation. It became clear that medieval justice wasn't just blind. It was also incredibly gullible, easily bribed, and possibly illiterate. In some areas, student gangs grew so bold that they began imposing their own taxation systems, demanding payment from local vendors in exchange for protection. Bribery evolved into a kind of unofficial bureaucratic ritual, just another part of the legal process. During court hearings, gang members would arrive not with lawyers but with bags of coins, fully aware that money carried more weight than any testimony. Some even took advantage of public festivals, volunteering to maintain security during celebrations, only to use their temporary authority to extort money from vendors. The city paid them to commit crimes, and the criminals, in turn, made sure the city kept paying. Eventually, these criminal collectives carved out unofficial zones within cities, many territories ruled by force and fear rather than governance. They didn't need government blueprints or official plans. They drew their borders with intimidation, and the average citizen left to fend for themselves. When the legal system failed completely, ordinary townsfolk had no choice but to take matters into their own hands. Small communities began forming their own grassroots defenses. Farmers, blacksmiths, tailors, and innkeepers organized patrols and watch groups, improvised law enforcement using little more than farm tools and sheer resolve. It was far from ideal. Facing trained criminals with pitchforks and slingshots was like trying to stop a siege with garden tools. But sometimes, sheer willpower was enough to tip the scales. Villages started devising clever tactics, digging hidden trenches to unseat horse-riding bandits, constructing barriers, or building narrow roads to make ambushes more difficult. Captured gang members were often tossed into barns or cellars, guarded by angry citizens who trusted their own judgment more than any corrupted court. In many places, community-run justice became the norm. Justice turned into a town-wide performance, where neighbors gathered to decide together whether a wrongdoer deserved punishment or just a very public lecture. The penalties they came up with were often uniquely symbolic. Public flogging sent a brutal message. Shaving the heads of criminals made them instantly recognizable. Exile was used as a way to rid the town of troublemakers without the burden of imprisonment. As these efforts expanded, larger coalitions of citizens formed peace guilds, alliances of shopkeepers, tradesmen, and farmers who pooled their resources to stand against the violent tide. But even noble causes can go astray. Over time, some vigilante groups began mirroring the very brutality they had sworn to resist. Power, once tasted, proved intoxicating. It became harder and harder to tell the difference between self-defense and vengeance. Once violence became routine, even the so-called protectors started losing sight of justice. Some kept fighting long after the original threats were gone, not because they had to, but because they had grown used to wielding power. The same tools used to defend freedom could easily be turned into instruments of control. Eventually, these criminal networks expanded beyond city walls and spilled into the seas. Organized crime took to the water, evolving into piracy, an equally ruthless and often state-sponsored version of the same violence. Coastal cities became pirate hubs, with networks that treated the ocean like their personal kingdom, complete with floating toll booths enforced by sword point. Among the most feared were the Vitalian brothers, who dominated shipping lanes in the English Channel and North Sea. They didn't need parrots or treasure maps to inspire terror. Just fast ships, sharp blades, and no hesitation. Merchant sailors dreaded encountering them, and for good reason. What made these pirates particularly lethal was their murky status during wartime. Nobles and kings would secretly back these criminal crews, using them as informal naval forces to weaken enemy nations. In essence, piracy became medieval outsourcing, delegating national defense to bloodthirsty entrepreneurs who preferred plunder over politics. Some coastal towns were extorted so often it became routine. Pirate ships would threaten to torch homes or sink local vessels unless ransoms were paid. And for most towns, choosing between financial ruin and complete destruction wasn't really a choice. These ships were built for speed, striking fast and vanishing before help could arrive. Their strength came just as much from escape as it did from violence. One infamous pirate crew even kidnapped a bishop, not for gold, but in exchange for barrels of fine wine. Clearly, even medieval criminals knew how to toast a win. Eventually, many towns began budgeting for pirate payments like a recurring expense. Paying off raiders was cheaper than rebuilding every season. As time passed, piracy became so entangled with politics that some governments stopped fighting it altogether. Instead, they redirected pirate aggression toward rival nations. What began as scattered crime turned into a geopolitical weapon. The rise of medieval gangs, by land and sea, reminds us that organized crime isn't modern. It's ancient, adaptable, and disturbingly persistent. But here's something to wonder. If pirates raided your town today, what would they demand instead of gold? If lost history and dark truths interest you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths, where the past never stays buried.